Have Nintendo changed their pricing strategy this year? And if so, why? While Doug Bowser's infamous statement about Nintendo's variable pricing strategy was issued in the summer of 2025, the 2025 lineup arguably didn't display a great deal of pricing variability. Sure, Dragon Drive and Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour, small downloadable titles, were more low priced, but the rest of the Switch 2 lineup was mostly sporting premium prices. Mario Kart World was $80, albeit less with the bundle, while Donkey Kong Bonanza, Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, Kirby Air Riders, Pokemon Legends ZA, Metroid Prime 4, all of these were $70 games, and the games announced for the early 2026 period, Mario Tennis Fever and Pocopia, were also $70. Obviously, I'm talking about the Switch 2 versions here. Several Nintendo Switch 2 edition titles also hit the $80 mark as well, including Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Super Mario Party Jamboree, and Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Since then, however, we've seen a bit of a change. First of all, Nintendo committed to doing what they'd already started doing in other territories with Switch 2 and initiated a different price for digital and physical copies, with digital copies being $10 lower. Quite whether this is a physical price rise or a digital price drop depends, of course, on your perspective. I actually suspect that in terms of their plans, given they instituted this in other places last April, they probably kept the differential as an insurance buffer given the uncertainty around tariffs in the American markets, and now they've been able to institute it. It helps, of course, that their early games were selling primarily to the most dedicated consumers, and they probably figured that those games would be less price sensitive, and pitching high gives the maximum flexibility for later on. It's far easier to offer a discount later than it is to raise a price later, after all. However, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, Star Fox, and Splatoon Raiders have all seen relatively low prices announced. Yoshi is $60 digital and $70 physical, while Star Fox and Splatoon Raiders are even more affordable, $50 digital and $60 physical. Part of this is evidently a reflection of the scale of the games in question. Star Fox is a new version of Star Fox 64, and while it's clear that they have lavished a lot of care and attention into bringing this game over, fundamentally it's a 20th century game at its core. Splatoon Raiders also appears to be a little smaller in scale. However, as I've covered in previous pricing deep dives, I think there are more factors that affect how Nintendo price than just these. Yoshi almost certainly has a premium attached for being in the valuable Mario franchise, albeit at the edge of the umbrella. That's why we're able to see $80 Mario Kart World and $60 Donkey Kong Country Returns HD and Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. Nintendo want these games to be resilient sellers, not just because they know the property is strong enough to override price concerns of many consumers, but also because these games are capable of selling at a trickle indefinitely, certainly for the next decade, and they want consumers to be paying prices that are at least moderately secure against a potential inflationary environment. After all, Donkey Kong Country is effectively a 15-year-old game, albeit with several add-ons over the time from the 3DS and now the HD upgrades. It's just the case that Nintendo can continue to sell their quality past games at a continued premium. Now, they haven't dipped the digital price of Bonanza, Kirby Air Riders, or others to match Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, but this is obviously something they can do if they wish. However, doing so would probably cause more problems than it solves, as some people would then query why they are doing it with some games and not others, and it's unlikely the differential will be all that significant after a while. Better perhaps to just use ad hoc discounts as required, or indeed to use other techniques to draw attention to the games. Splatoon and Star Fox have different considerations. Neither are part of the lucrative Mario property, despite Nintendo's willingness to put Star Fox into their 2026 film. That means that they need to be a little more cautious on pricing than they are with a more established property like Mario or Zelda. Splatoon in particular skews younger, and so it's of benefit to them that it's more affordable, plus giving these titles a stronger start out of the gate, maybe aiming to create some momentum and buzz around them, especially since in each case the titles are evidently on the smaller side of the spectrum for what these properties could do. Splatoon 4 and potentially an original Star Fox game would show their hard work paying off, and so it's worth it for them to cultivate a strong and accessible entry-level experience on the Switch 2, even if this does limit their income from these games in the medium term. Another factor that I'm sure did play into these things is the fact that the price rise of the hardware was on the cards. Nintendo often ameliorate pricing issues by defraying those costs across the rest of their line, and particularly laying their big pricing increases onto accessories instead of the core console. We see this most notably with accessory pricing rising sharply as a result of tariff changes in 2025, it would seem, but the games are also a way to absorb these main costs in a manner that is more subtle than the headline sticker price of their main console. However, that strategy only works so far, and taking their foot off the gas for prices this year probably helped. One question raised a while ago by Parker in the comments was whether Nintendo, in retrospect, might have priced past games differently. I do think if Bonanza, Age of Imprisonment, or Kirby Air Ride released in 2026, they probably would have had a cheaper digital edition, but otherwise all those titles had a profile which made the logic of their prices fairly inevitable. Bonanza was the major single-player launch window title, Age of Imprisonment was a third-party collaboration, and Air Riders was a Sakurai game. Soft pedaling the price was never going to be an optimal move for them here. There's also the importance of what's often called the anchoring effect. A common example cited is that if you're selling something, mentioning and then instantly disregarding a ridiculously high price at the start is still going to frame in people's minds a scoop of what's reasonable that's different than if you started by mentioning and then discounting a very low price. Unless people's sense of what something should cost is exceedingly well established, people are susceptible to adapt their expectation of what seems reasonable from contextual clues quite readily, even in a manner that's basically subconscious. Therefore, at the start of a console's life, given the choice between going too high and going too low, there's more short-term reputational risk from going too high with prices. See 3DS, PlayStation 3 and Sega Saturn for past examples of this, but there's actually another deeper problem, which is going too low with prices. This isn't something that would ever be a reputational problem in the public sphere, really, but it would be a long-term drag on the financial success of a company like Nintendo if their major product line is underperforming the price that it should be at, especially if the Switch 2 is designed, as it is, to last for potentially a decade. Again, dropping the price later, even if temporarily, is relatively easy. Increasing prices is difficult. I think putting Mario Kart at $80 had multiple motivations, including the fact that they needed it to provide cover for the Nintendo Switch 2 Edition games, which were, with the $20 expansions, going to be $80 anyway, and to inflation-proof their games. But fundamentally, I think Nintendo was communicating a price point for the generation ahead. Of course, nothing is certain, but generally it's rare to see price increases from Nintendo mid-generation. Tears of the Kingdom was $10 more expensive than other games on the market, but there was at least a reason given in terms of the more expensive game card, and it was the sequel to perhaps their most iconic game of the generation, and so it did have a lot more leeway. The cheekier one to my mind was actually putting Super Mario Galaxy 1 Plus 2 at $70, something they managed to sneak largely under the radar considering the price consternation at the time. Of course, it did get mentioned, but I don't feel it received anywhere near the flack of some of the other pricing decisions, even though in many respects, pricing an original Switch game at $70, especially one that, let's face it, is two older games, seems a little bit more of a drastic step up in terms of their pricing approach to me. However, we're now entering the second year of the machine and the anchor is set. It's trivial for Nintendo to undershoot their top price now if they wish, and nobody is going to be enormously surprised when $80 is still asked for titles like 3D Mario, Animal Crossing, and the next Zelda, because that expectation has already been baked in. There'll still be some consternation, but I can't imagine it's going to generate quite as many headlines when we get the second and third game at this price as opposed to the first, especially if they are really huge titles indeed. Also, while the digital discount is good for consumers who are ambivalent about digital as opposed to physical, the digital purchases would still almost certainly be more profitable for Nintendo depending on the specific retailer cuts, so it's kind of a win-win situation for them, especially if they can normalize brick-and-mortar stores selling digital codes as a method of offering discounts, something which has considerable benefits for everybody as the shelf space requirements are lower and the transportation, storage and returns costs are far more negligible. Everybody's a winner. So will we see another $80 title by the end of the year? I mean, it's still possible. If Nintendo has a big Zelda title, including even an Ocarina remake, that game could sell indefinitely, and they'll want a secure, high price that is resilient to demand. They will likely see $70 for a digital version as their concession to keep people sweet, but I could definitely see them pricing it at $80 physical. I also think this makes opening the door to a $90 physical game a little more plausible in the long term, since they have already broken the Rubicon of $80 digital titles through the presence of Mario Kart World. Now, I suspect this will be years away and probably only for something truly huge like the next mainline Zelda, but it still seems like an interesting wrinkle in the whole discussion that hasn't been fully factored in. In terms of forecasting at the moment, I'd say 70% there's another game that retails for $80 physical by the end of the financial year. 10% there's a game that retails at $90 physical by the end of the financial year, not including games with accessories bundled. That's it for this video, but thanks for watching as ever. Particular thanks to the Patreon supporters of the channel. Do check it out for early, ad-free and exclusive content, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.